how does the biblical worldview explain indigenous plants? Similar to what Diane presented, eucalypts are a good example in Australia because we're such a long way from anywhere. And why are they here and not elsewhere? But that's what we're going to look at now. But I thought I might just define what we mean by indigenous. It simply means naturally occurring and native to a particular region, as opposed to exotic, which is introduced into a region from elsewhere. And that can be obviously by humans, but it could be, even from what Joe was saying, by ocean currents, if Scotland was warm enough for them to grow, those plants from the Amazon, for example, or even, as Diane presented, technically those snails that are distributed by the birds are exotics that have been introduced to those islands. Endemic simply means they're a plant or an animal that's only known from that particular region. So there's just a few definitions. But the fossil record, as we've already really mentioned, infers that the world was once much more diverse. It had a lot of different plants that we don't have today, and a lot of the plants were much more widely distributed than they are today. So what's happened? We should also just note that every major group of plants and animals that we have alive today are present in the fossil record in the same rock layers that dinosaurs are in. So it's just an interesting fact to remember, and that includes the eucalypts, as we'll get to. One example of a tree that was once far more widely distributed than it is, it was in recent modern history, is the ginkgo. So it's known from actually Tasmania. I've been given a nice little fossil from a Tasmanian geologist of ginkgos from Tasmania. Joe was saying that he's got some from North America, I think, Joe, and Europe. But it was actually thought to be extinct by European scientists until it was discovered in China, where it had been cultivated by Buddhist monks and had survived. So in about 1700s, Europeans started planting it, and people in the Americas as well. And it's now, again, distributed all around the world. In fact, we had it growing on our university campus in Canberra when I was there. But it was not only just more widely distributed previously, it also had more forms. There's at least 5 to 7 different forms of ginkgo known in the fossil record, but there's only the one now that's ginkgo biloba, the one that you can see in the picture there. So there's 3 key factors we need to consider influencing plant distribution from a biblical viewpoint, from a biblical worldview, and that's, of course, the pre-global flood distribution of plant kinds. Why do we find fossils in certain countries now? Well, that's simply where they died, not necessarily where they lived, I guess, but we can infer some things that from the Bible, that the world was once a single large landmass, because in Genesis it says God gathered the water to one place. So from that we can assume the land was in the other place, and therefore it was one big landmass, and therefore plant distribution, would have been perhaps much more simple there by animals and people and so on, and wind and water flow down rivers and so on. Would have been quite different, but it's largely speculative because it's a world that we don't really know today. second factor is the effect of the flood on dispersal and survival of regenerative parts. Joe's even covered some of that, how some plants can be distributed by floodwaters, rafting, all sorts of things would have occurred through the flood. Various factors need to be considered. The ability of plants to regenerate from the parts that were distributed, and this can include, of course, the seeds, but also plants regenerate from broken off stems or broken off root masses. So if these are distributed by the flood and then deposited in mud, they might as well, it might just regenerate from that as well. In fact, the seeds of many poorly dispersed plants were quite likely spread widely by the flood. So a lot of the herbaceous plants have very poorly dispersed seed on a normal sort of situation, but in the flood they may well have been disturbed and distributed by the waters. And then, of course, we've got the post-flood survival and dispersal after the flood, and diversification of the different plant kinds, which we'll talk about a bit more as we go. So let's just get down to explaining the lack of indigenous plants in the fossil record of their area. So if you have an indigenous plant and it doesn't have any evidence in the fossil record that it was there historically, that simply might be because we haven't found them yet, that they occurred there, but they just weren't fossilised during the flood. They were distributed there during the flood process, but didn't occur there before. They were brought there after by people, or they're actually a variant or a mutant within their kind that arose following the flood. So I've just lost myself here a little bit.
It's all right, take your time.
So that's just answering why didn't plants grow back everywhere. Let's just get on to the eucalypts. Eucalypt distribution is a good example to look at. Currently, the genus Eucalyptus is only known from Australia, Indonesia, Timor, and the Philippines. But it is known from fossils from South America, New Zealand, and South Africa. Let's have a look at this map. So the red dots there are where the fossil evidence is saying they once occurred, and the green dots is just basically indicative of where they are now found. So we just want to ask, why didn't they regrow in New Zealand, in South America, and even Africa after the flood? Well, other plants, including casuarinas, they're a type of oak tree that occur in Australia. They didn't survive in South America or New Zealand as well. Acacias, which we know as wattles, callistemons, which are bottle brushes, they still exist in Australia as well, but didn't regrow in New Zealand, but they are there also in the fossil record in New Zealand. Conversely to that, plants known in the Australian fossil record no longer occur here, but are still found in places like New Zealand and South America. So what's happened? And the simple explanation is that the world has substantially changed, and it better explains this dilemma that is raised in a scientific publication by people that hold to evolution. They say this: however, the reality is that eucalypts did become extinct in South America, and reasons for this are at present one of the great unsolved questions of Southern Hemisphere vegetation evolution. Well, I think if you have a biblical worldview, you can understand the answer to this dilemma a lot better. The flood really helps to solve the evolutionist problem as well as the changed post-flood environment, because the right growing conditions for those species simply didn't occur post-flood. They might have occurred in South America, they might have occurred in New Zealand. They were destroyed there in the flood, and the growing conditions changed after the worldwide flood, the first major climate change, and they just simply can't grow there. Both the southern parts of South America and New Zealand are wet, cold environments, and these are not environments conducive to eucalypts, especially given the fact that there's a lack of fire. So eucalypts can occur in cold climates, including in the mountainous areas that have snow and so on in Australia. But those areas are regularly burnt as well, and certainly would have been burnt in summer by Aboriginals. But in New Zealand and South America, there's a much lesser fire regime. Possibly soil microorganisms that are associated with eucalypt growth didn't survive in those regions following the flood. Or we could also propose that eucalypts did survive in New Zealand and in South America, but as another component of the broader created kind, the broader eucalypt kind. And we'll just have a look at that a little bit later. So Australia has changed as well. The changed environment after the flood, would obviously include temperatures. We've just been talking a little bit about that. Joe mentioned the droughts and so on that came on after the flood period. It's mentioned in the Bible. Soil conditions can change, soil fertility, even the pollinators present can influence what plants might have survived in a region. Scientists acknowledge that the fossil record in Australia, as Shoghiwa's question alluded to, was once warmer and wetter. There were a lot of lush plants preserved in Central Australian fossil deposits, and that's where some of the evidence is that it was much better as well out there. The argument has been that eucalypts and other Australian plants evolved as the climate has dried out. So that's the evolutionary worldview, is that eucalypts actually evolved in Australia as the climate dries out. And this infers that eucalypts would not have lived in those warmer and wetter environments, those lush environments previously, but that rather they evolved in response to the climate change. So we need to really be able to answer this question: did eucalypts evolve to survive in the Australian environment? Well, on this, one scientific report said that the fossil record says there was a highly diverse sclerophyll, that means leathery-leaved plants that existed under lots of rainfall and summer wet climates, and the regional loss of this diversity occurred at the same time as a decline in rainforest diversity. So they're saying this rainforest, this lush vegetation was right across Australia, but that it's declined. So to understand what's really going on, we've got to understand, I think, we need to cover what a created kind is. So the Bible says in Genesis 1 that God created plants according to their kind. Let's just read it. God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seeds in it. according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So on the third day, God created plants according to their kind. So we need to ask, what is a created kind? And here's an example we have at our museum, where down the left-hand column, you've got the various taxonomic levels that many people will be familiar with, starting at the top with the plant kingdom. Down the right-hand side, it's an example using the Tasmanian blue gum, how it's defined within that classification system. So the bottom two of that would give you Eucalyptus globulus, the way we normally define a species. But a created kind might not have been that Eucalyptus globulus. It may well have been in the Myrtaceae family level, and this includes a whole bunch of trees and other plants as well. But there's some important factors for understanding variations in created organisms. Now, this is a little bit technical, but hopefully I can get it across understandably. If you understand that a created kind is not necessarily a species as we know them in the modern world, but could be of this family, then it will help you understand how similar looking but nevertheless different species of plants can fit within the biblical creation framework. Secondly, you'll have to accept that plants can exhibit changes within their created kind, but that is normally a result of what genetic characteristics it started with in the ancestral form, not what they've evolved. It may even include some mutations, but it's not from what characteristics it has evolved from some other sort of plant, starting from algae, going right up through various what they would call primitive plant forms until you get these more advanced plant forms like eucalypts. We don't accept that has happened because that would step outside of created kinds. In other words, the biblical model of plants is predicting that created kinds have genetic and physical boundaries as to how far they could vary from their original ancestral created kind. Nevertheless, it's important for us to accept that the ability to change within those limitations is part of God's creative genius. Now, if we think of the dog skulls, think of how different a Great Dane's skull is to that of a Chihuahua. Now, if they were extinct organisms and we found those skulls in the fossil record, would we consider them to be of the same species? I doubt it. I think people would think that they, just from the variation in their skulls, were completely different species. But we know today that they are indeed of the same created kind. Now, a eucalypt ancestor was believed to be this plant here called Myrtaceoides eucalyptoides. It was only known in the fossil record from pollen, and in fact, initially that's what was known in South America from pollen records, but they did find eucalypt fossils later. And in Africa, the Burundi site in Africa is only known from this ancestor. And Myrtaceoides has quite a distinct pollen, but a discovery of a fossil eucalyptus flower in South America just in recent years has enabled fossil pollen to be examined from that flower. The pollen discovered had two distinct forms, and they examined over 60 grains from the one flower that they had found in the fossil record. And what they discovered, it was definitely a eucalypt flower, but the pollen found was from this Myrtaceoides. So Myrtaceoides is a eucalypt. And the authors of the paper said this, that both forms of the pollen were produced by the one individual. So there was different types of pollen in the one flower, showing a diversity in that eucalypt ancestor, that created kind. They also said that the pollen grains found within the anthers have features that are highly variable. And this remarkable variability could have led to the identification of at least two different species if the grains had been found isolated or dispersed in the sedimentary rocks. In other words, if they found those two different looking pollen grains and no other evidence of the eucalypt, then they would have been regarded as different species, but clearly it's come from the one flower. So this shows diversity within the one plant, and diversity that was already there, and Myrtaceodytes was a eucalypt all along. It wasn't an evolutionary ancestor as such. So you can see how evolutionary scientists can get confused by this variation that can occur through natural selection and within the actual created kind. Now, since eucalypts survive better in a drier, fire-prone environment, scientists are baffled how they could survive the very wet period they believed occurred after the Cretaceous. The evidence shows that even the central parts of Australia, which we've said, were once rainforests. Now, if you look at the broader eucalypt kind, you can see some of the other genuses that are within the eucalypt kind, and you can see that some of them to this day still occur in rainforest. In fact, Lophostomen, the one on the very top there, is known as brushbox. To the untrained eye, it just looks like a eucalypt. I used to work with these in New South Wales. They occur in very wet rainforest gullies, and they look for all money like your standard eucalypt. Further down, Corymbia. When I started my work in forestry, Corymbia was known, the Corymbia group was actually known as eucalypt. So spotted gums and bloodwoods, Corymbias. And Gophoras, same thing. They were once known as eucalypts but have been split off. So, and they occur in drier areas. So you can see that whole range of habitats, and it's just that eucalypts really are the ones that had the features, they already had the features that would enable them to survive in a drying climate. I actually am a bit of a nerd in this area, but I've got quite a collection. This is just a small part of my collection of eucalypt woody fruits. You can see there's quite a lot of diversity in that. And just remember the dog skull example. Dog skulls are highly variable. Think of the British Bulldog compared to a Chihuahua as well. Really different. And I think that's what's going on here with the eucalypt kind. Right in the middle, I'm not sure if you can see it, it's my arrow there. Yeah, it's coming across just down where my arrow is there. That's actually an Angophora there in the sort of middle of the middle row. And you can see that's quite a similar fruiting body to the eucalypts. Okay, so eucalypt, in terms of the actual eucalypts that are found in Australia, have some amazing survival abilities that enabled them to survive. And they've got these leathery leaves. They've got leaves that actually hang so that they're not getting the full blast of the sun. There's oil in leaves, the eucalyptus oil that a lot of people know, a beautiful smell that actually is very flammable. And this is one of the reasons they can actually encourage fires. And eucalypts are well adapted to, well designed maybe to survive fires. Stomatal control. So the stomata is the little pore in the leaves, and not all plants have the ability to close their stomata, but eucalypts do. So when it's very dry, they can close their stomata and they don't lose the moisture out of them like a lot of other lush rainforest plants would. Coppice, lignotubers, and epicormic shoots we can cover in a video that I've done that we're going to look at shortly. Woody fruits, the seeds are protected in these woody fruits that I just showed you, and that's how they can help survive fires. And the mycorrhizal is the fungal partnership that they have in Australia. Okay, so Sam, maybe you could play that video now just to show some of these lignotubers and so on.
One of the features that helped eucalyptus survive in a drying environment in Australia is their ability to send shoots up from the stump. It's called coppice. And in the deserts, for example, mallees, which are basically stunted eucalypts that send lots of different stems up from a stump, from a base, can survive and come back from a drought, fire, or even cutting. So let's just have a look at some examples of coppice on a Tasmanian bluegum. You see there lots of shoots coming out of the base of a tree. Lots of them there. There's probably at least 20 or 30 shooting up, and each one of those can become a tree in their own right. This one's a 7-year-old bluegum, and you can see the shoot that has grown into a tree off the old stump. One of the regeneration strategies that eucalypts use is also found in their young sort of saplings. In fact, sometimes they're not quite so young because they've been reshooting for so many years, but they have the ability to shoot from a tuber just under the soil surface called a lignotuber. And we're on the edge of a road here, and there's a number of eucalypts that keep coming up after the slashing, and we'll see if we can find a lignotuber on the base of one that will pull up. There's one right here, and we'll see if we can pull this guy up and see what we find. You can see this swollen base of the stem here, this ball here, and several shoots coming up from it. That's called the lignotuber, and this is on a Eucalyptus amygdalina, or black peppermint, that's common in Tasmania. Now, this ability that eucalypts have to send shoots up from a stump or from a lignotuber in the younger ones or the smaller plants that are constantly disturbed in a drying environment, so drought, fire and so on, is one of the reasons eucalyptus survived in a drying Australia when many other plants that we know have been here didn't survive. Now, this is an example of natural selection, but it's not an example of evolution, because the eucalypts have this ability to start with, otherwise they would have died out as well. Now, another reason that eucalypts have been so successful, particularly in a fire-prone environment, is their ability to send out epicormic shoots when the main canopy has been destroyed by fire. These epicormic shoots come from buds along the stem, and they can come back after the crown has been removed for various reasons. In this particular stand we're going to have a look at, it's because of just general sickness in the trees, but we'll have a look at them, and you can see them in this tree just on the edge there. They're not normal branches. You can actually see the canopy has died, the top branches have died, but down the stem are these branches that have shot out from epicormic shoots, and there's actually quite a number of them on various trees in here which are sick for an unknown reason to me, but possibly just the general eucalypt dieback that we see in this area.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So basically the eucalypts, the genus of Eucalyptus, has retained these features that have helped them survive in the Australian context. And This survival of the eucalypts as a reason for their presence in Australia is actually a surprise to scientists who have long believed that eucalypts arose through evolution as a response to the drying of the continent. But this quote here is an example of some that have realised the evidence is more pointing to the survival idea. So they said that the species that became extinct in the two countries, and they're talking about Australia and South Africa and various groups they're talking about, and they're saying they became extinct during the ice ages, were likely to be most sensitive to rapid climate change. So the species that now grow may be more capable of tolerating rapid changes than predicted by current science. Okay, so that they've realised that eucalypts are the survivors. They had the features that enabled them to survive in a changing climate, and they were able to do that rapidly. They came up with perhaps a strange and somewhat contradictory conclusion. They said Australian and South African researchers have shown that part of each country's rich plant diversity was wiped out, and they're saying by the ice ages, proving that extinction rather than evolution influences biodiversity. Well, that seems to be a backward way of thinking for evolution, but it is actually what we see, that the world is one of extinction and loss of creatures and biodiversity, not one of upward and improving evolution. So the biblical record of history, I think, fits the evidence much better. Yes, the Bible predicts a warmer, wetter, and better original, very good created world. There would have been greater plant diversity pre-flood in God's amazing creation, and that there was regional and global extinction of plants in changing environments after the flood. And this is what we're seeing in the Australian context.